Hello, dear friends, and welcome to part 8 of this whispered read-through of a truly fascinating book. The 70 Great Mysteries of the Ancient World, Unlocking the Secrets of Past Civilizations, where we go over the myths and legends of yesteryear and ancient history, and compare it against the archaeological and historical data we have available. We're at the halfway point now, and we are starting off with a fascinating topic, the Tarim Mummies. Who were they? This quote here from Orlstein in 1928. It was not without a strange emotion that I looked down on a figure, but for the parched skin and the deep-sunk eye cavities, seemed like that of a man asleep, and found myself thus suddenly brought face to face with a representative of the indigenous people who had inhabited, and no doubt had liked, this dreary Lop region in the early centuries of our era. So we're looking at Western China from 1800 BC to 400 AD. And the best preserved mummies in the world do not come from Egypt or Peru. They are found in the sands of the Taklamakan, the vast desert of Western China that forms much of the Tarim Basin. So the other civilizations referenced sought to preserve the human form artificially after death, but these mummies were preserved naturally in the arid and salt-laden sands of Eurasia's second greatest desert. And here is a mummified man from Zaganluk, 1000 to 600 BC, so this could be well over 3,000 years old, with ochre spirals about his temples and a strap to bind his mouth closed in death. That is absolutely fascinating. This is somebody who died thousands of years ago, and it really does look like just an image of a man sleeping. You can eat that. There's also this tattoo on the side of his head. Just fascinating. They were first discovered at the turn of the 20th century, when Sven Hedin of Sweden, Albert von Lecoq of Germany, and Orlstein of Britain sought to uncover the antiquities of the oasis towns that form the northern and southern spins of the Silk Road linking China to the west. They excavated mummies, photographed and described them, but there weren't any facilities to preserve them and take them to Western museums. So it's only recently that Chinese and Uyghur archaeologists have been able to make more scientific investigations into the region. There are at least 300 mummies now known, which date from around 1800 BC until the historic period when the Han dynasty attempted to extend its power westward in the first centuries. Here's one of the 3 women from Sebeshi, one of them wearing a long, tall witch's hat and a woolen skirt and blouse with leather shoes and a sheepskin coat. Her left hand is still covered with a leather mitten, and her right hand is bare. Beautifully preserved clothing. So, there is in fact no mummy people. The mummies derive from different sites and cultures along the southwestern and northwestern sections of the Silk Road. They were covered in shallow pit graves, deep pits covered with layers of reeds, brushwood, timber logs, animal hides, brick-built chambers, all sorts. The earliest ones were clothed in the simplest of wrappings, woolen blankets, but after 1000 BC we find them fully dressed and boasting feathered caps. One man was apparently buried with no fewer than 10. We have shirts, cloaks, trousers, colourful woolen stockings, and plaid tartans. The mummies have an enormous quantity of prehistoric clothing for textile experts who are now only really beginning to analyse it in detail. And these people don't have the kind of Mongol physical type that dominate East Asia today. Their light hair and beads indicate that they were either early settlers, well, they're probably early settlers of the Tarim region, Caucasoids or Europoids. So before the Bronze Age, that is around 1800 BC, the archaeology of Xinjiang is very poorly known. The first settlement of the region remains so obscure that we can only speculate who was the first to settle there. It's quite an uninviting world. But an overwhelming body of evidence suggests that it was people of Caucasoid stock who migrated either from the western mountain ranges or the northern steppes, because besides the mummies, we have skeletal remains, and of these, only 11% of the over 300 prehistoric human skulls examined so far belong to the people of the Mongoloid physical type, and these are found primarily to the east of Xinjiang. So who were they? If they belonged to a totally anonymous group who didn't survive to be recorded in written history, we could be forever in the dark and just assign them the names of the various archaeological cultures that have been identified for the Bronze and Iron Ages. But there is some reason to hope that their descendants actually survived into the written record. So the Tarim Basin has preserved not only a large quantity of human and other organic remains, but a vast library of early manuscripts. It's one of the first regions of China to adopt Buddhism, and a religion that placed great emphasis on the written word. A lot of them have recently imported languages of India, such as Sanskrit, and confined to the Buddhist monasteries. But some contain the language of native populations, and they could be divided into two major groups. So the first one is Khotanese, or Khotanese Saka, spoken around the ancient town of Khotan in the South Tarim, and in some of the oases to the northwest of the Tarim Basin. So the language belongs to the Iranian group that includes Persian and many of the languages of West Central Asia. The closest language to Saka was probably that of the Scythians. To the north-east of the Tarim and Turban basins, as well as Lopnir, all areas from which we recover most remains of mummies coincide better with the later distribution of the Tocharian languages, which is a group of Indo-European languages. We might read words like Basa, Mesa, Prosa, Se, Ku, Oxo, Du, Tua, Nu, which are cognate. They share the same Indo-European ancestor with English, like father, mother, brother, sister, cow, ox, you, door, and you, respectively. So we don't have any pure Tocharian texts, but Indic documents are filled with native loanwords and personal names that suggest that they have this Tocharian substrate. Another colour image here of a woman with tattoos on her forehead and eyelids, and her eyebrows have recently been painted in black and her hair is braided. Just so incredibly well preserved. Fascinating. So images and paintings around the time depict Caucasoid features and light hair, eyes and beards, and DNA analysis of one of the mummies indicated that it shares the same genetic inheritance as is typical among some 40% of modern Europeans. Tartans found with the mummies around 1000 BC are remarkably similar to the earliest tartans in Europe, from the site of Hallstatt in the Austrian Alps. The Tocharian languages appear to have separated from the other Indo-European languages at a very early date and developed in isolation from the rest of the Caucasoid population. So these people are known as the Avanesovans, settled in the Minusink Basin. There is some evidence that they might have moved southwards to settle in the Tarim Basin too, but although far from substantiated, does provide an attractive explanation for how an isolated Indo-European language spoken by a population originally deriving from Europe found its way into the west of the Tarim Basin, and a movement would also provide a linguistic identity for the earliest mummies. Our next question is, were the Olmecs African? Of course, these very famous stone heads and statues. This is Matthew W. Sterling making the first scientific observations on the Tracer boat's colossal head in 1939. So this could be around 1200 to 900 BC in southeast Mexico. We have a quote here from Olga E. Serrano. I was struck with surprise as a work of art. It is without exaggeration a magnificent sculpture. But what astonished him was the Ethiopian type represented. So were the Olmecs creators of ancient Mesoamerica's oldest civilization? Were they migrants from Africa? All the evidence indicates that they were Native Americans descended from Paleo-Indians who entered the Americas from the Northeast Asia. But there is absolutely no evidence to support the suggestion that Africans reached the Americas prior to the voyage of Columbus. Archaeologists haven't identified a single African artifact, element, or any other concrete evidence of African presence in Olmec country or elsewhere in the Americas. So why did this question ever arise? While visiting a sugar hacienda in South Mexico's Tuxtla Mountains in 1862, Jose Melgar Serrano was shown a giant head carved from basalt, uncovered by a worker there several years below. Melgar was an educated man interested in ancient Old World civilizations, and now realized that this sculpture, known as the Tres Zapotes Colossal Head 1, was a highly unusual find. In later years, he speculated on the meaning of the head and the ethnic identity of the person depicted in 2 published articles. The ideas that dominated the climate at the time held that, like their oppressed 19th century descendants, pre-Columbian Native Americans must have lacked sufficient intelligence or capacity for culture to create large or beautiful works of art. So Melgar assumed that migrants from the Old World must have carved the head and identified the patronages in Africa, especially in Ethiopia. Melgar's head then lay almost completely forgotten until 1939, when archaeologist Matthew W. Sterling cleared it once again in the course of his pioneering investigations of Olmec culture. The investigations at Tres Zapotes La Vente, Cerro de las Mesas, and San Lorenzo brought Olmec culture to the attention of the scholarly world, and widely read in articles in National Geographic magazine. So subsequent investigations recovered hundreds of stone sculptures, including 17 other colossal heads. So most modern scholars agree that these unusual monuments are portraits of living or recently deceased Olmec rulers, but none of the other 17 look particularly African, and no professional archaeologist since Melgar's time has ever accepted his ethnic identification of the Tres Zapotes head. So how did the question of African Olmecs emerge as a serious concern in recent times? So in a recent comprehensive examination of the issue, Gabriel Aslipiera and his associates traced the history of the idea to the writings of Ivan van Sertima, particularly his book They Came Before Columbus in 1976. Van Sertima, who isn't an archaeologist, argues that Africans made numerous voyages to the Americas long before Columbus's voyages, and created or at least strongly influenced the earliest civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America. No serious scholar accepts these claims, though they have become a central foundation myth for the contemporary Afrocentric movement in North America. Afrocentric revisionist history argues that all the world's early civilizations, including those of ancient Europe, ancient Mesopotamia, India, China, Europe, and the Americas, were created or inspired by racially black peoples. Van Sertima and other writers cite 5 basic lines of evidence to support their claims, written documents from various times and places in the Old World, that the features depicted on the Olmec colossal heads, architectural correspondence between Olmec earth mounds and the stone pyramids of Egypt and Nubia, plants native to one hemisphere found in the other, and the practice of mummification in the Americas. Haslip and Vieira and his colleagues examine the evidence for each claim in detail and refute every one of them. So given the prominent role that the Olmecs played in the origins of Mesoamerican civilization, it's not surprising that Afrocentrists have revived the fanciful ideas of a 19th century savant to bolster their claims. Ironically, they also perpetuate the equally mistaken racist ideas of the same period, ideas that relegated Native Americans to an inferior status, incapable of major cultural developments, on a par with peoples of the ancient Old World. We now have a rather grim question. Why did the Carthaginians sacrifice children between the 8th and 2nd century BC, Carthage, Tunisia? have clay tarkas, the late 4th century BC, saying out of reverence for Kronos, the Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians, whenever they seek to obtain some great favour, vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity, if they are especially eager to gain success. So Carthage was settled in what is now northeastern Tunisia by Phoenicians and the eastern Mediterranean as their new city. Tradition ascribes the foundation to Queen Dido, the year 814 BC, although nothing in the archaeological record has been found so far that predates the mid-8th century BC. Carthage's position at the very centre of the Mediterranean and its control of a fertile hinterland enabled it to expand and flourish, and in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC it ruled a considerable empire. Its sway extended over much of present-day Tunisia, as well as many settlements on the North American coast from Morocco to western Libya. There are overseas possessions in Sicily, Sardinia and Spain. So Carthage's territorial ambitions, however, brought it into conflict with that other contemporary Mediterranean superpower, Rome. The resulting power struggle was fought out in 3 Punic Wars, culminating in the utter destruction and humiliation of Carthage at the hands of Rome in 146 BC. Here we have the steles coming from the excavations of the Carthage tuffet and have been arranged in a garden, and so are not in their original positions. This is a stela with the sign of Tanit, dedicated by Hanno, son of Mothan Baal, in the 2nd and 1st century. This is a diagram to illustrate the position of the sacrifice of the incinerated bones were placed in the urn and buried below ground, and the stela on the surface above marking its position. And here's a stela in the Bardo Museum in Tunis, 3rd century BC, showing a map, a priest perhaps with a flat cap and raising his hand in an act of reverence, carrying a child in the crook of his left arm for sacrifice perhaps. So the deities of the Carthaginian pantheon were dominated by the sky god Baal and his companion Tanit, often enigmatically described in inscriptions as face of Baal. In other words, the female counterpart or reflection of Baal. So whereas Baal was a familiar deity in the Phoenician homelands, Tanit wasn't, and in Carthage she took over from Astarte as the principal female divinity after her introduction in the 5th century BC. Baal was a somewhat remote and frightening deity, a god of the remote hill regions, especially of mountain tops, but also of fertile plains and lord of the sky. A god, in other words, of the entire universe. Tanit, in Carthaginian script, Thanit, though Thinith in Greek, was above all a goddess of the sky, and a provider of all the rain that was such a vital contributor to agricultural prosperity, and the principal guardian deity of the city of Carthage. So both Baal and Tanit demanded and received heavy sacrifices, which took place in the sacred open-air precincts known as Tophet. In Carthage, it's clear from the many thousands of Tophet inscriptions that it was principally Tanit who was the focus of cult and sacrifice. The 800 dedications at Constantine in eastern Algeria, on the other hand, are mainly in honour of Baal. Tophet does not occur on inscriptions in places such as Sardinia and Sicily, but it is used in the Bible to refer to places in the Phoenician homelands where child sacrifice took place. So the Tophet at Carthage was discovered in 1921, some 50 metres west of the site of the Punic artificial harbours on the southern edge of the ancient city. A vast open-air walled precinct covering at least 6,000 square metres, and excavations over many years revealed thousands of urns containing partially cremated bones, each pot buried in a pebble-lined pit. Most were marked at the surface by a small carved throne or stone block, a cypress carved with a petal, which was an oval or bottle-shaped stone, a representation of the deity. From the 4th century BC onwards, however, it was customary to place a tall stone slab stela, bearing simple relief or incised carving, and sometimes also an inscription in honour of Baal and Tanit, and with the name of the dedicator. Although there were clearly early fluctuations in frequency dedications at the Carthage Tophet are continuous between the mid-8th century BC and the destruction of the city in 146 BC. So it's been estimated that an average of approximately 100 urns were deposited each year, making a total of some 60,000 sacrifices in all. That's intense. So the excavations in the Carthage Tophet in the late 1970s provided the first detailed statistical figures for these depositions. The cremated bones consisted of both human and animal remains, but contrary to what was expected, there was not a gradual substitution of human sacrifice by animal offerings. Animal sacrifice constitutes as much as a third of the total in the earliest depositions, whereas in the 4th century this figure had dropped to as little as 1 in 10. 90% of the remains of sacrifices at that period were human. A further distinction is that whereas in earliest times, the 8th to 6th centuries BC, the bones were those of stillborn or neonatal babies, the majority of the sacrifices in the 4th century BC are of children between the ages of 1 and 3. In fact, as many as a third of the urns at this time contained the remains of 2 and sometimes even 3 children. That is horrific. The reason for these changes, and indeed why human sacrifice was thought necessary at all, is hard to explain in the absence of explicit written testimony. It would be tempting to think that the switch from sacrificing newborn infants to that of killing toddlers was prompted by military or economic crisis, but such a neat link is unprovable and probably unlikely, and in particular the evidence for Tophet ritual in the final period leading up to the biggest crisis of all, the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, was largely erased by later Roman activity and cannot be accurately assessed. So various hypotheses have been advanced. The votive inscriptions show a clear predominance of wealthy dedicants. It's possible that it became the practice of the Carthaginian elite to sacrifice their firstborn, recalling that biblical account of the firstborn of thy sons shalt thou likewise give to me in Exodus. Unfortunately, the condition of the bones does not allow their sex to be determined, although early DNA tests have been able to establish sex in a few cases. DNA might also be able to show whether the multiple infants in some urns came from the same family or not. Some have seen infant sacrifice as a form of birth control, akin to the Spartan practice of exposing unwanted children on a hillside to die, and the sacrifice of older children, however, is harder to explain. It's been suggested that a baby was promised to Tanit while still in the womb, and if it proved to be stillborn, an older child in the same family was sacrificed in its place, but that presupposes a very high incidence of infant mortality. Sabatino Moscati has suggested that the Greek and Roman authors and biblical writers were peddling vicious anti-Semitic propaganda, and that both babies and young children had already died from natural causes before they were incinerated. Such a view, though, contradicts everything that we know about the act of sacrifice in the ancient world, that must involve the hardship, in this case to the parents. So for it to stand any chance of being successful with the deity, rather than counting merely as an alternative method of disposal of the dead, forensic archaeologist Charlotte Roberts also studied the bones of 20 infants from the Modia Tophet and found no signs of disease or ill health. Here is one still in its position at Carthage with a later Roman vaulted structure above. So after the Roman takeover in North Africa, the cult of Baal and Tanit continued under a thin Romanizing veneer. The deities were renamed Saturn and Calestis, and their worship endured strongly until the advent of Christianity. The one aspect of foreign religions everywhere that Rome did not tolerate appears to have stopped at 146 BC, which was human sacrifice. Re-excavation under modern conditions of those Tophet which continued after 146 BC, like Zeus and Constantine, together with detailed examination of the burnt bones, may one day be able to test whether Tertullian was right that human sacrifice here continued in Africa. But his testimony is a vivid reminder that the practice of Carthaginian child sacrifice was still remembered nearly 4 centuries after the fall of Carthage. Ancient oracles, were they prophets or profiteers? Well, that's something that I've always always wondered myself, was it all smoke and mirrors? 6th century BC to the 4th century AD. Here's Heraclitus in the 6th century BC. The Lord, whose oracle is in Delphi, neither speaks out nor conceals, but gives a sign. So the ancient Greeks believed that gods spoke to mortals and might offer guidance about the future, and divine communication was part of daily life. Seers travelled from city to city selling prophecies or offering to interpret omens. The pattern of a bird's flight, the remains of a sacrifice, images in a dream, even the timing of a sneeze, any of these signs might, if construed correctly, reveal the god's will. The divine messages considered most significant by the Greeks were delivered by oracles. They were fixed sites, such as the Oracle of Delphi, of course, usually sanctuaries where gods or heroes could be directly consulted. The most famous oracle then was that of Apollo at Delphi, as I mentioned, but numerous others were mentioned throughout the ancient literature. So the popularity of individual oracles rose and fell over the centuries. New sites sprang up, some fell into disuse, but nevertheless, for over 1,000 years, individuals and city-states visited these institutions for guidance on crucial decisions, and in return presented them with elaborate gifts, often extraordinary treasure of great value. But what kind of help visitors to oracle received has long posed a puzzle. Many of the well-known stories in ancient Greek literature portray their messages, especially those from Delphi, as tricky and misleading, often with catastrophic results for their recipients. So it's unclear why the Greeks wanted to trust them with important decisions, nor are we certain about the methods of prophecy used at these sites. The mystery of the oracles continues to seduce and stump scholars today. Here's an image on a cup, dated from the late 5th century BC. Aegeus, a king of Athens, consults the goddess Themis, a mystical predecessor of Pythia, and Aegeus consulted the oracle about his lack of children, and later fathered the hero Theseus. So the oracle of Apollo at Delphi received the most attention in both ancient literature and modern scholarship. The prophetess called the Pythia was believed to enjoy divine inspiration and considered the most prestigious method of prophecy among ancients, but how it worked is controversial. Tradition asserted that she entered a state of divine ecstasy, brought on by chewing laurel leaves and inhaling intoxicating vapours from a mysterious chasm over which we sat on Apollo's tripod. The incoherent ravings were translated into verses by sanctuary priests called profiteers. And initially scholars accepted this portrayal while trying to rationalise it. Some theorised that the profiteers were merely passing on information gained from one visitor to another. Others suggested more venal motivations were at work, describing priests as wily psychologists who found out people's secrets and told them what they wanted to hear, or even as political schemers who used their unique position to support favoured causes. Here is a view of the sanctuary at Delphi, with the remains of the treasuries in the Temple of Apollo and the theatre. This is the treasury of the Scythians, and was probably one of the most richly decorated buildings in the sanctuary. Here is the detail of the north frieze of the territory, depicting the battle between the gods and the giants. And up here is the head of ivory and gold, which is part of a life-size statue thought to represent Apollo, Delphi's patron god. It was found amongst the remains of a shrine dating to around the middle of the 6th century BC that had been destroyed by fire, and then buried beneath the sacred way at Delphi. So the success of such scams can seem unlikely because the Greeks were perfectly aware of the dangers of fraud in this area. In the popular comedies of Aristophanes, characters frequently criticized crooked and greedy seers, so no such accusations were made against the oracles, even though we know their visitors would charge some kind of fee. Very few stories do describe attempts to bribe the Delphic oracle, but these are rare. They're clearly meant to emphasize the execrable nature of the corrupter rather than the inherent dishonesty of the oracle. So how could this happen, particularly if the Greeks were careful to ensure that no individual, group or state could claim ownership of the oracles? So the riches belonged to the god alone and were left on display in each sanctuary for his glory, and only very rarely in the direst straits did anyone dare to borrow them, and there was a heavy penalty. Delphi and the other oracles were perceived as, and as so far as we can tell, intended to be sincere agents of prophecy. Even the early Christian writers, in their anxiety to discredit the oracles, do not accuse them of corruption, preferring to denounce their oracles as the creation of evil demons. So how did they function in Greek society? So recently 2 areas of research raised interesting, though controversial, insights into the question. Anthropological studies of oracles in contemporary cultures introduced comparative material that widens our understanding, while close analysis of the phrasing and content of surviving ancient oracular consultations prompted a reconsideration of traditional accounts. So it appears that the Greeks, like people in many cultures that use oracles, didn't turn to them out of general curiosity. Instead, they consulted them about particular courses of action, seem usually to have been seeking confirmation of decisions already made. So questions were most often phrased so that they suggested a yes or no response. The oracle in the sanctuary of Zeus at Dodona provides most of the evidence for individuals' inquiries. Though we are told that Delphi heard similar questions, they covered many aspects of daily life: marriage, children, work, and travel. State inquiries included consultations about political issues and the founding of settlements. Oracles also appear to have functioned as arbiters of religious matters, crucial in a society that otherwise had no religious experts. Individuals frequently asked oracles to identify which god they should address to ensure the success of a project, which state inquiries often concerned adjustments and innovations in religious practice. Historical responses indicate that visitors at oracles did not normally suffer the ambiguous riddles of traditional stories, and instead they could get straightforward pronouncements in prose. Some think that the Pythia at Delphi spoke these directly to her clients herself, and the nature of her divine ecstasy is debated. Comparisons with similar institutions in other cultures suggest that it may have functioned as a form of resistance, that is, a mechanism that reinforced some appearance of objectivity in the speaker. The vaporous chasm and the effects of chewing laurel were almost certainly figments of later writers' imaginations. So the sanctuary at Dodona yielded thousands of inscribed strips of lead, bearing questions put by inquirers at the oracle, and very occasionally answers. On this one, Hermon is asking to what god he should pray in order to get children from his wife, Crataia. And here is the east frieze of the Sphinian treasury, showing the combat of Achilles and Memnon in the Trojan War. And here is the Delphic charioteer, one of the few and earliest original life-size bronzes to have survived from the early classical period. It was part of a larger group, including a chariot, horses, and perhaps a groom dedicated to Delphi to Apollo by Polyzelus, tyrant of Gela, Sicily, in the 470s BC. So these analyses may have made it easier to understand how and why the Greeks consulted our oracles, but it leaves us wondering about the ambiguous messages of traditional stories. Did they ever make such prophecies? The ancient Greeks believed they did, attributing them to an earlier practice that died out, and that's still a popular explanation. Other scholars suggest that these stories are simply mixtures of proverbs, folk tales, and the kinds of general prophecies that were in widespread circulation at the time. But whatever explanation we accept, these stories clearly explain how the Greeks viewed the difference between mortal and divine knowledge, and that in turn helps us understand why they turned to oracles for what they saw as guidance about the future. That brings us to the end of part 8 of this fascinating read-through of the 70 mysteries of the ancient world. Thank you for joining me, and of course, as always, look forward to having you join me next time for more whispered mysteries. Until then, goodbye.